This is a true account from the unforgiving winter of 1883, a story etched not in ink but in the frozen heart of the Wyoming Territory. It speaks of a truth more profound than written law, that the measure of a man is not the breadth of his shoulders, but the capacity of his heart. The land itself was a crucible, a vast, indifferent expanse of white plains and granite peaks that cared little for the ambitions of men. In that year, the snows came early and with a biblical fury, burying fences, erasing trails, and locking the world in a coffin of ice. It was a time for hunkering down, for counting rations, and for praying the firewood held out. For Elias Eli Vance, it was a time no different from any other. Solitude was the air he breathed, a thick and heavy element he had pulled around himself like a shroud. The other trappers and the few ranchers who clung to life at the edge of civilization called him too fat a Vance, a cruel descriptor that was less an observation of his considerable girth and more a judgment on his inertia. He had once been a man of sinew and motion, but grief had settled on him like a second skin, a layer of insulation against a world that had taken his wife and infant son in a fever storm 2 winters prior. Now, his cabin was a tomb of memory, the small, unused rocking chair by the hearth a constant, silent accusation. The wind, a ghost with a throat full of razors, shrieked against the log walls. It was a sound Eli knew well, the voice of the emptiness both outside and within. But on this day, another sound pricked his consciousness, something faint and desperate carried on the gale. A cry. It was madness to go out. The blizzard was a white maelstrom, a vortex of blinding snow that could disorient a man in his own yard. Yet, the sound persisted, a fragile thread of life in a world determined to extinguish it. He pulled on his bearskin coat, the weight of it a familiar burden, and strapped on his snowshoes. The men who mocked his size did not see the power that lay dormant in his frame, the strength of a grizzly hibernating through a long winter of sorrow. He stepped out the door and was swallowed by the storm. He was no longer a man in a landscape, but a single, stubborn thought moving through a great and terrible mind. The world was a formless, roaring void of white. Visibility was measured in feet, and the cold was a physical predator, sinking its teeth into any exposed flesh. Eli moved by instinct, following the ghost of a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. His breath plumed and froze instantly on his thick beard, encasing his face in a mask of ice. He was a mountain moving through a hurricane, his great size a bastion against the wind's implacable assault. He fought for every step, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air that felt as sharp as shattered glass. This was a fool's errand, a death wish born of a phantom noise. He was about to turn back, to surrender to the roaring logic of the storm, when he saw it. A patch of color against the suffocating white. A small mound, nearly buried, from which a single swatch of red, beaded buckskin protruded. He clawed at the snow with his gloved hands, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. First, he uncovered a face, small and still, its skin a terrifying shade of blue-gray. It was a child. An Indian child. Then he saw the second one, curled against the first for warmth, her own small body shivering in the last, desperate throes of life. They were Sioux girls, no older than 7 or 8, their dark hair matted with ice, their deerskin clothes no match for such a monster storm. They were moments from death. A chasm of choice opened before Eli. To leave them was to let the wilderness claim them, a fate it had already sealed. To take them was to invite a world of trouble into his isolated existence. They were Sioux. In this part of the country, that word alone was a spark in a powder keg. But as he looked at their faces, he did not see a political problem or a racial complication. He saw children. He saw the ghost of his own son, his own lost future. The grief that had been his anchor for 2 years suddenly became his engine. He would not let the storm take these two. Not while he still drew breath. With a guttural roar that was lost in the wind, he scooped them up, one under each arm. Their weight was terrifyingly slight. He turned his back to the wind and began the long, impossible journey back. The cabin door slammed shut against the howling blizzard, plunging the room into a sudden, profound silence broken only by the crackle of the hearth and Eli's own ragged breathing. He laid the 2 girls gently on the bearskin rug before the fire, their small bodies as stiff and cold as cordwood. For a moment, he feared he was too late, that he had only brought their corpses in from the cold. But then, one of them, the slightly older girl, let out a tiny, shuddering gasp. Hope, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful, surged through him. He worked with a desperate, focused urgency he had not felt in years. He stripped off their frozen, ice-encrusted clothes and wrapped them in his own thick wool blankets, chafing their limbs with a roughness born of necessity, forcing the blood to remember its purpose. He warmed broth on the fire, and when they were conscious enough, he spooned it past their cracked lips, drop by precious drop. He did not know their names. They did not know his. A canyon of culture and language separated them, but in the flickering firelight of that isolated cabin, they understood the universal language of care. The girls, whose names were Chopper and Zintkala, watched him with wide, dark eyes, a mixture of terror and nascent trust. He was a giant, a mountain of a man unlike any they had ever seen, yet his hands, for all their size, were gentle. For hours, he tended to them, his sorrowful quiet replaced by a purposeful one. He was no longer just a grieving hermit, he was a protector. As the afternoon bled into a deep violet twilight, a frantic pounding echoed on the door. Eli's body went rigid. He took his rifle from its pegs above the mantel and opened the door a crack. It was Silas Croft, a gaunt, weasel-faced trapper whose cabin was a half-day's ride away. Silas stumbled in, covered in snow, his eyes wild with fear of the storm. Then his gaze fell upon the two small figures wrapped in blankets by the fire. He saw their dark hair, the discarded, beaded moccasins. His face, already pale, turned the color of ash. "Vance, my God," he stammered. "What have you done?" "Those are Sioux." Eli's expression hardened into a mask of granite. "They're children," he said, his voice a low rumble. Silas backed away, his hands raised as if to ward off an evil spirit. "They'll come looking for them," he hissed. "They're warriors. Or worse, the cavalry will hear of it. They'll say you stole them. There's a bounty on runaways from the reservation, Vance. You've brought a curse into this house." Eli simply stood, a silent, immovable wall between the chattering trapper and the sleeping girls. Silas did not stay the night. He took his chances with the abating storm over spending another minute in what he now considered a cursed cabin. "You're a dead man, Vance," were his parting words, a venomous whisper that hung in the air long after the door had closed behind him. Eli knew the man was right, in a way. He had not invited trouble, he had carried it over his own threshold. The world he had so carefully shut out was now coming for him. He spent the rest of the night not sleeping, but watching. He sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, his gaze shifting between the two sleeping girls and the dark, frost-rimmed windows. The firelight danced across their faces, softening their features, and in their peaceful slumber, he saw the echo of all he had lost and the terrifying weight of what he now had to protect. The blizzard broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world remade in pristine, treacherous white. The silence was absolute. It was this silence that felt more threatening than the storm's fury. Sometime mid-morning, he saw him. A lone rider, a stark, dark figure moving slowly against the blinding snow. He was not a white man. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched as the rider dismounted, his movements fluid and certain. He was tall and lean, wrapped in a buffalo robe, a rifle held loosely in one hand. A warrior. He had come for the girls. Eli stepped outside, his own rifle held non-threateningly at his side. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. The two men stood 50 yards apart, separated by a sea of untouched snow and a chasm of mutual suspicion. The warrior's face was a study in grim purpose, his eyes scanning Eli, the cabin, the smoke curling from the chimney. He was reading the story of the last 24 hours. Eli gave a slow, deliberate nod. He gestured with an open hand toward the cabin door. It was an invitation and a statement, "I have what you seek, and I mean no harm." The warrior did not move for a long moment. His gaze was intense, analytical, searching for the lie, the trap. He was Kanji, the crow, and the girls were his kin. He had tracked them relentlessly, his heart a cold stone of fear in his chest. He had expected to find their bodies, or worse, to find them in the hands of brutal men. He did not expect this, a lone, giant white man, standing guard like a patient bear. Kanji took a step forward, then another, his snowshoe sinking softly into the deep powder. His eyes never left Eli's. He was prepared for violence, for the sudden, treacherous bark of the white man's rifle. Every instinct, honed by years of conflict and broken treaties, screamed that this was a trick. Yet, the big man's stance was not aggressive. It was rooted, solid, like an ancient oak tree. There was a weariness in his eyes that Kanji understood, the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. When Kanji was 10 paces from the door, it swung open. The older girl, Zintkala, stood framed in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket far too large for her. Her eyes widened, and a single word escaped her lips, a sound of pure relief: Kanji. The warrior's stoic facade finally cracked. The rigid lines of his face softened, and he closed the distance in 3 long strides, dropping to one knee before the girl, speaking to her in the soft, flowing cadence of their people. He touched her face, his hand gentle, assuring himself she was real, that she was warm. The younger girl, Chopper, appeared behind her sister, and Kangi's relief deepened. He looked up at Eli, his dark eyes now holding not suspicion, but a profound and complex question. Before any further understanding could be forged, a new sound intruded upon the quiet landscape. The jingle of harnesses and the guttural laughter of rough men. For riders appeared over the rise, their dark coats stark against the snow. At their lead was a man with a cruel, pinched face and a long, drooping mustache stained with tobacco. Jedediah Kane. A man who made his living from the misery of others, a bounty hunter and ex-soldier who believed the only good Indian was a dead one, or a captured one, if the price was right. Silas's words had found fertile ground. "Well, well," Kane called out, his voice a greasy sneer that slid across the snow. "Look what we have here. 2 fat Vants, playing house with a buck and 2 little squaws." Silas was right. "You've got property that don't belong to you." Vance Eli moved to stand beside Kanji, a silent, implicit alliance formed in the face of a common enemy. The 2 men, a dispossessed warrior and a grieving homesteader, stood together, a bulwark before the cabin door. "They ain't property," Eli's voice was a low growl, stripped of all warmth. "They're children. And they're under my protection." Kane let out a harsh laugh, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Your protection," he mocked, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the pure white snow. "That's rich. There's a $500 bounty on any buck, doe, or fawn caught off the reservation. I reckon these 2 and their warrior friend here will fetch a handsome price down at Fort Laramie. Now, you can stand aside, Vance, and live to get fat another day. Or you can die here, protecting something that ain't your concern." He and his men casually raised their rifles, the movement practiced and menacing. The metallic click of hammers being cocked was unnaturally loud in the frozen air. Inside the cabin, Zintkala pulled her younger sister behind her, her small face a mask of terror. Kanji said something in his tongue, his voice low and steady. Eli didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of a man who would die where he stood. A fragile thread of hope had been spun in that cabin over the last day, a hope for peace, for understanding. Now, Jedediah Kane was about to sever it with a bullet. Eli's gaze shifted from Kane's sneering face to Kangi's resolute profile. He thought of the small, empty rocking chair by his fire. He had failed to protect his own family from the fever. He would not fail to protect this one from the sickness of men's greed. "You'll have to come through me," Eli stated, his voice flat and final. He raised his rifle, the motion slow and deliberate. Kane's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "Have it your way, you fat fool," the world exploded. The first shot was not from Kane's men, but from Kangi's rifle, a puff of black powder smoke erupting as one of the bounty hunters was thrown from his saddle. The air was instantly filled with a deafening cacophony, the roar of rifles, the splintering of wood as bullets slammed into the cabin walls, the terrified screams of the children within. Eli fired, the recoil jolting his powerful frame, and another of Kane's men clutched his shoulder, his face contorting in pain. The fight was a chaotic, brutal ballet of violence. Eli and Kanji fell back into the doorway of the cabin, using the thick log walls for cover. They moved with an unspoken synergy, a warrior's swift precision paired with a frontiersman's raw power. Kanji would fire, then drop to reload, and in that instant, Eli would step forward to send a heavy slug of lead toward their attackers. Bullets tore through the doorframe, kicking up splinters that flew like angry wasps. A shot grazed Eli's arm, a hot, searing line of pain he barely registered. His world had shrunk to the space between his rifle sights and the snarling faces of the men trying to kill him. Inside, Chopper and Zintkala huddled by the stone hearth, the only solid place in a world being torn apart. The gunfire was a physical force, shaking the very foundations of the small cabin. One of Kane's remaining men made a desperate rush, thinking to overwhelm the doorway. Kanji moved with the speed of a striking snake. His rifle was empty, so he dropped it, drawing a long, heavy knife from his belt. He met the man's charge with a fluid grace, the struggle short, sharp, and deadly. The man fell with a choked gasp, his pistol firing harmlessly into the snowy ground. Now it was just Kane. Enraged, the bounty hunter spurred his horse forward, firing his revolver wildly. Eli stood his ground in the doorway, a colossal, immovable object. He took aim, not at the man, but at the horse. It was a terrible, necessary calculus. The horse screamed and went down in a tangle of flailing limbs, pinning Kane beneath its weight. The bounty hunter roared in pain and fury, trapped and helpless. Eli strode out from the cabin, his boots crunching in the blood-stained snow. He walked past the fallen men without a glance, his focus entirely on the one who had brought this violence to his door. He stood over Jedediah Kane, his shadow falling across the man's face. Kane stared up at him, his sneer gone, replaced by a primal fear. The too-fat cowboy looked down at him, his face unreadable, his rifle held steady. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the whimpering of the dying horse and Kane's ragged, panicked breaths. The fight was over. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. The snow, once pristine, was now scarred and stained with the brutal evidence of the conflict. 3 bodies lay still in the cold. Jedediah Kane lay pinned and groaning, his legs shattered beneath his dead horse. Kanji stood beside Eli, his chest heaving, the bloody knife still in his hand. He looked at the carnage, then at Eli, and gave a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of respect, of an alliance sealed in blood and shared purpose. Eli did not kill Kane. He walked back to the cabin, retrieved a length of rope, and bound the bounty hunter's hands, leaving him to his fate. Justice in the territory was often slow, but the cold was swift and impartial. He then turned his attention to his own wound, a shallow but painful gash on his forearm. Zintkala, seeing the blood, approached him timidly. She reached out a small hand and touched the wound, her eyes wide with concern. She then tore a strip from the edge of her blanket and, with a solemnity that belied her years, awkwardly wrapped it around his arm. It was a simple, profound gesture of care, a closing of the circle. As Eli tended to the dead, pulling their bodies away from the cabin, Kanji spoke to the girls, his voice soft and reassuring. The sun was higher now, its light brilliant on the new snow, washing the world clean. The storm had passed. Both the one in the sky and the one on the ground. Later that day, they appeared. A long, silent procession of riders emerging from the distant pines, moving across the snow like a mirage. It was Kangi's people. The Oglala Sioux. They were led by an old man with a face like a weathered map of the plains, his presence radiating an authority that needed no words. This was Chief Hehaka Sapa, Black Elk. They stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, their dark, stoic faces taking in the scene, the dead bounty hunters, the bound and defeated Kane, the lone warrior standing with the giant white man, and the 2 small girls who were the cause of it all. Kanji went to his chief and spoke for a long time, his hands gesturing, painting the story of the blizzard, the rescue, the fight. He pointed to Eli, his expression one of deep respect. Chief Black Elk dismounted and walked toward the cabin. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes, deep and knowing, fixed on Eli. He stopped before him, studying the large man from his worn boots to his ice-cake beard. He looked at the makeshift bandage on Eli's arm, placed there by his grandniece. He saw the silent, protective way Eli stood before the cabin door, even now. An interpreter, a younger man who had ridden with the war party, stepped forward. The chief spoke, his voice low and resonant, the words ancient and powerful. The interpreter translated. "He says you fought like a grizzly bear protecting its cubs," the young man said. "He says you have the body of a bear and the heart of a father," the chief spoke again, his gaze unwavering. "He says these girls were lost to the storm. The Great Spirit, Wakantanka, meant for them to die. But you stood against the storm. You stood against the evil of these men. You returned them to the world of the living." There was a long pause. The entire war party watched, silent and still. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Chief Black Elk looked at Chopper and Zintkala, who now stood on the porch behind Eli. Then he looked back at the big man who had saved them. He spoke one final time, his words carrying the weight of law and spirit. The interpreter's voice was filled with awe. "He says they no longer belong to us. Their lives were forfeit, and you bought them back with courage and blood. The spirits have decreed it. From this day forward, Chopper and Zintkala are your daughters. You will be their father. This is our gift to you. This is our honor." Eli was stunned into silence. He looked from the chief's unyielding face to the two small girls peeking out from behind his legs. Their tribe was not taking them back. They were giving them to him. It was a judgment, a reward, and a burden of impossible weight and grace. He had lost a family and, in the crucible of a single day, had been given a new one. He had no words. He simply bent down and placed a huge, gentle hand on each of the girls' heads. It was acceptance enough. The Oglala did not linger. Their justice was as swift as the winter cold. They took the bound Jedediah Cain, whose fate would be decided by their own laws. They took their fallen kin to be mourned. Kanji was the last to leave. He approached Eli, the canyon of culture between them now bridged by shared combat and mutual respect. He placed a hand over his own heart, then extended it to Eli. Eli clasped his forearm, a warrior's grip, firm and solid. No words were needed. Kanji looked at the girls, now clinging to Eli's legs, and a rare, small smile touched his lips. He said their names, Chopper and Zintkala, then pointed to Eli and said a new word, 8, the Lakota word for father. He mounted his horse and, without a backward glance, rode off to rejoin his people, a dark figure shrinking against the vast, brilliant white of the plains until he was gone. Eli Vance was left alone in the profound silence, the two girls his only anchor in a world that had been irrevocably altered. He led them back inside the cabin, the air still thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and fear. But the hearth was still lit, a warm, beating heart in the center of the small home. His gaze fell upon the small, empty rocking chair, the symbol of his long, stagnant grief. For 2 years, it had been a monument to what was lost. Now, he saw it differently. He looked at Chopper, the younger of the two, her eyes still wide with the day's terror. He gently picked her up, she weighed almost nothing, and set her down in the small chair. It fit her perfectly. He then looked at Zintkala, who watched him with an intelligent, solemn gaze that held the seeds of a deep and resilient strength. He had been a man defined by an ending. Now, standing in the quiet of his cabin, flanked by two daughters gifted to him by the very wilderness that had sought to claim them, he was a man facing a new beginning. The hole in his heart had not vanished, but it was no longer an empty void. It was a space being filled, moment by moment, with a new and terrifying and beautiful purpose. The too-fat cowboy, the lonely hermit, was gone. In his place stood a father. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true strength isn't measured by physical size or societal judgment, but by the courage to act with compassion in the face of hatred and fear. Elias Vance was an outcast, a man broken by grief, but his choice to save 2 innocent lives redefined his existence and forged an unbreakable bond across cultures. It proves that even in the harshest of winters, the warmth of a single, righteous act can thaw a frozen heart and create a family. If this story of courage and unlikely fatherhood moved you, please show your support. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates tales of true heroism. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these incredible true stories from history. And we want to hear from you. What did you find most inspiring about Eli's story? Let us know in the comments below.